All right, welcome. Today we're digging into a huge question, one that's really at the foundation of so much of our history. Where did the whole idea of whiteness even come from? So let's get right into it, because the sources we're looking at say something pretty shocking. It wasn't always a thing. It was invented.
And this quote from Eric Williams, well, it just cuts right to the chase, doesn't it? The core idea here, according to our source material, is that things happened in the reverse order of what you might think. It wasn't racism that led to slavery. No, the economic system of slavery was already up and running, and racism was created after the fact as a justification, a really powerful one, to keep that system in place.
So let's roll back the clock. The sources we're examining are pretty specific about this. They say the concept of whiteness was invented at a particular time and in a particular place. We're talking about the back half of the 17th century in the colonies of the British Empire. And it wasn't some abstract philosophical idea. It was created for a very, very practical reason. Okay, so here's what's so fascinating. The original dividing line between who could be enslaved for life and who couldn't, it wasn't race at all. It was religion. See, in the early colonies, the argument from Christian leaders was that it was a duty to enslave non-Christians, people from Africa, for instance, in order to convert them. But that same logic created a sort of protection for fellow Christians, like the indentured servants from Europe. You just couldn't ethically enslave them for life. But that religious dividing line, it ended up creating a huge, huge problem for the wealthy plantation owners. It led to a situation that was basically their worst nightmare, which brings us right to our next point. So you got to picture what it was actually like back then. Life was just brutal for pretty much everyone at the bottom of the ladder. You had European servants and enslaved Africans working side by side under horrific conditions. And you know what? Both were basically treated like property. And when you have that kind of shared misery, you start to find a common enemy. In this case, it was the wealthy elite, who were, by the way, living in constant fear that these two groups would team up against them. And then, in 1676, that fear became very, very real. It's called Bacon's Rebellion. A multiracial army of poor and enslaved people rose up together and actually burned Jamestown to the ground. For the ruling class, this was it. This was the nightmare scenario. It proved that their labor force was dangerously united. They absolutely had to find a new way to keep them divided. So how do you solve a problem like that? This is the moment, according to the source material, where the whole idea of a racial hierarchy is born. It's a solution. Let's look at how they put it together. And the solution was, well, it was as old as time. Divide and conquer. The plan was to deliberately shatter that alliance of the oppressed, so the colonial elite started giving poor Europeans new privileges, a higher status, a status based not on their religion anymore, but on the color of their skin. They were intentionally pitting poor whites against enslaved black people to make sure they'd never ever unite again. This chart just lays out the strategy perfectly. Before the 1680s, the magic word was Christian. But there was a loophole, right? An enslaved African could convert and then make a case for their freedom. The new system, based on race, was airtight. It was permanent. You can't change your skin color with baptism. As a tool for control, it was way more effective. Now, this wasn't some accident. It didn't happen overnight. It was a deliberate, step-by-step legal strategy. First, new legal protections were created, but only for European servants. Next, they passed laws to slam that loophole shut, making it clear that getting baptized did not mean getting freed. And finally, by 1681, the language itself changes in the laws. The distinction isn't religious anymore. It's officially all about privileging whites. You know, an idea this radical, this new, it needs a lot of work to make it stick, to make it seem like it's just the natural order of things. So over the next few centuries, this whole intellectual and cultural scaffolding gets built around it. And as you can see here, the justifications just kept evolving. At first, they went back to the Bible, reinterpreting stories to support this new hierarchy. Then, as science became more prestigious, you get the rise of pseudoscience and eugenics, trying to prove racial superiority. In the 20th century, things like IQ tests were used to argue for some kind of built-in difference in intelligence. And, the source argues, even today, concepts like reverse racism are used to protect that original power structure. And this new racial system wasn't just a social idea. It was written into the DNA of the United States. The Constitution itself had all these clauses that were designed to protect the economic engine of slavery, from the 3/5 clause that gave slave states more political power to giving the federal government the authority to crush rebellions and hunt down people who had escaped. So, this whole history creates this deep central conflict that our source argues has really defined the American story ever since. It's a constant push and pull, like a giant pendulum of power swinging back and forth. And the two sides of that swing are what the source calls despotism and democracy. The despotism periods are all about top-down, authoritarian racial oppression that's actually written into the law. But every time that happens, it sparks a reaction, a swing towards democracy, which is defined by grassroots movements, people on the ground fighting back for civil rights and justice. This chart really shows you that swing in action. You have the long era of despotism under slavery, which gives way to a brief, bright period of democracy during Reconstruction. But then the pendulum swings hard back into the despotism of Jim Crow. That, in turn, is challenged by the Civil Rights Movement, another democratic wave. And according to the source, that's followed by the era we're in now, another period of despotism it calls the color-evasive era. So what on earth is a color-evasive era? And how does thinking about history this way help us make sense of the really intense arguments we're having about race in America right now? Well, the source defines color-evasive racism as the main ideology of our current moment. It's basically the belief that big, systemic racism is a thing of the past. From this point of view, any racism that's left is just the fault of a few bad apples, a few individuals. It's not the system itself. It's an ideology that says, I don't see color. And this historical framework leads us straight into today's culture wars, right? Especially the whole debate over critical race theory. Now get this, look at this poll data from 2021. It's wild. Only about a quarter of people said they'd even heard about the theory, but a huge majority, 62%, already had a negative opinion of it. I mean, that right there shows you the massive disconnect in the public conversation about how we're supposed to teach and understand this history. And this isn't just an argument online. It has real-world legislative consequences. We've seen this wave of bills in states all across the country trying to restrict how things like systemic racism are even talked about in schools. It's a direct fight over which version of our history is going to be told. As we start to wrap this up, this final thought from the source material really hits home. The argument is that for racism to keep going today, it doesn't actually need a lot of overt violent hatred. In a system that was built on a racial hierarchy, just doing nothing, just complacency and silence, is enough to keep it alive. So that leaves us with this final question to chew on. If American history really is this constant swing between authoritarianism and democracy, where's that pendulum right now? And what actions or inactions are deciding which way it's going to swing next? Something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.